All right, hi everybody. We are moving on with chemistry of life. We're talking about lipids in this talk here. So let's carry on. So lipids, what are they? They are fats, oils, and waxes. That's the common name for these things here. So the common name, come on, let's do better than that. Common names are fats, oils, and waxes. So fats, oils, and waxes. And in terms of like the things that we eat, we typically eat fats and oils. So we typically eat fats and oils. We get this through our food, but waxes are things that these are made by plants and animals. But yeah, the things that we typically eat are the fats and oils. Okay, so if you look here, we've got some different types of fats and oils. Here we've got some like vegetable oil, some cooking oil. Here we've got some animal fat. Here's butter down here. Everything's better with butter. And then we've got, I think this is, I'm not entirely sure. I'm assuming that these are cheeses over here. Cheese has a lot of fats and oils in it. Coconut oil also has a lot of fat. And then down here, these are the waxes that we were talking about. So you can get beeswax. Bees make wax. Where else do we get wax from? Like shea butter. Shea butter is a wax. Yeah, lots of different sources of waxes. Lipids are mostly made of carbon and hydrogen. They're also made of some oxygen. So let's just highlight this. There is some oxygen in it, and it's a fairly significant amount. It's not a small amount, but I would just say some. It's not as much, not as much as carbohydrates, or at least not in the same ratio, right? Not the same ratio. There's typically more carbon and hydrogen than oxygen. And predominantly, there's probably the most is probably hydrogen. Now, lipids are one of the biological molecules that don't have any monomer. There are building blocks, but there's no monomer for lipids. So they are macromolecules, but they are not polymers. The building blocks that they have are glycerol and fatty acids. This here is glycerol. And then fatty acids are these ones here. These are the fatty acids. These are fatty acids, okay? And you can see here that they're predominantly, look at all the carbons here. We've got carbon, carbon, carbon. But then we've got, look at all these hydrogens here, right? Hydrogen, 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 hydrogen. So there's lots of hydrogen. It's not in the same ratio that we had in carbohydrates. And then if we kind of carry on here, look at this one here, carbon, 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 carbon. Let's use the highlighter maybe. So here's our carbons over here. I'll make them, let's make them orange. So here, these are the carbon, 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 carbon. And then we've got lots of hydrogens as well. Look at all the hydrogens here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So there's lots of hydrogens and carbons here. They're mostly carbon and hydrogen. You'll notice that in the middle, for most of the carbons here, you'll notice that they almost all, especially ones in the middle, have these CH2 groups. There's a CH2, here's another CH2, right? 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen. And at the very ends, they have these CH3 groups. And at one end of them, the other end, so they're mostly carbon and hydrogen for the majority of the chain. But over here, we've got this 1 carbon attached to 2 oxygens. Let's use a different color for those ones. Attached to these 2 oxygens. And then we've got this hydrogen here. So we could write this as a COOH group, okay, and we often do. So at the end of this molecule here, this is the COOH group. This is the COOH group, which is also known, you can also write this as a carboxylic acid. And so because it's a carboxylic acid, we call this a fatty acid. So this is kind of the carboxylic acid is the acid part, and this chain here is the fatty part, I guess. Okay, and when it's made of mostly carbons and hydrogens, we call this the hydrocarbon. It's a hydrocarbon. And so there's a hydrocarbon here, and it's got the carboxylic acid at the other end. So it's an acid and a fatty and a fat, or a fatty hydrocarbon. So it's a fatty acid. All right, there's lipids have lots of functions in living things, but primarily the ones that we're going to discuss the most are that they build cell membranes. So there's a specific type of lipid called a phospholipid, which we'll talk about in a second here. They're also used for long-term energy storage. That's a specific a specific lipid called a triglyceride. And then they're also used for growth and development. We use these chemical messengers called hormones that send messages all around the body to help organisms grow and develop and help to coordinate all the different systems and tissues inside of living things. So phospholipids are up here, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute here, but this is the structure of a phospholipid, and it's got this glycerol backbone and then the fatty acid tails. So again, like we said, the building blocks of a lipid are usually glycerol. So here's glycerol, and then the fatty acids. And so this one has two fatty acids here. Here's a fatty acid there. Here's a fatty acid here. These ones are fatty acids. And then the phospholipid has this phosphate group, which is a PO4 3- group. This is called a phosphate group. And this is very polar. This is very, very polar. As a matter of fact, it carries a charge with a charge. You can see this little negative charge here. So it's very polar. It carries a charge. It loves being in water, but these fatty acids, they are hydrophobic. So let's write this in. They are hydrophobic. In other words, they're non-polar, right? They are non-polar. And so they don't like to be in water. So because of that, it kind of has this non-polar end over here, and then a polar end over here. That gives it all the properties that it has for being really good at building cell membranes, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And then down here, here's a triglyceride. It's really similar to a phosphate. Again, you've got a glycerol backbone. So here's the glycerol, right? You can see glycerol. And then it's got three fatty acid chains this time. So it's a triglyceride. So tri refers to three fatty acids. 1, 2, 3 fatty acids, right? Here they are, 1, 2, 3. And again, look, they're mostly hydrocarbons, right? So carbon, there's tons of carbons there. There's only a couple oxygens. I have to erase the marker here, just 1 second. So there's only a couple oxygens right there. Those are the oxygens. But the rest are carbons and hydrogens, as you can see. So very hydrophobic, very non-polar tails here. This is a very non-polar. A triglyceride is a very non-polar molecule. Okay, and then over here are some examples of hormones, and you can see that, remember, that all of these lines show a carbon. Wherever two lines meet, there's a carbon. So there's a carbon there, There's a carbon there, there's a carbon there, there. So you can see that there's lots of carbons around on this, on these molecules. And remember that even more so, all of these carbons, they need to make 4 covalent bonds. So this one makes 1, 2. Well, where's its other 2? They're going to hydrogens over here. So again, they're mostly just carbons and hydrogens. Oh, I forgot a carbon over here. Here's a carbon. And remember, this one only has 1 covalent bond, so it needs to make 3 more, right? It's making 3 more covalent bonds to these hydrogens. This one here has already made its 4 covalent bonds. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one here has already made its 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one here has only made 2. 1, 2. So we need 2 more hydrogens, right? 3, 4. This one here's only made 2, so 1, 2 covalent bonds, so it needs more hydrogens. So you can see that you could keep doing that over and over, and you can see that there are lots of carbons and hydrogens sticking off of this molecule. So it's mostly carbons and hydrogens. Same thing with cortisol, same thing with cortisol here and estrogen. There's some oxygen, but mostly carbons and hydrogens. And so we can use fatty acids to synthesize or to create these hormones, testosterone, cortisol, and estrogen. Testosterone is typically associated with the male reproductive traits. During puberty for males, estrogen is typically associated with the female reproductive traits in humans. And cortisol is a stress hormone. It triggers this, or it signals or starts or triggers the stress response. So whenever you're feeling stressed out, your levels of cortisol tend to increase. And you can see that these are all examples of lipid-based hormones, or they come from lipids. So lipids are typically the starting point. So what our bodies do is that they will use they'll take one of these fatty acids and they'll change it into a hormone through metabolism. Because remember, metabolism is the chemical reactions that use energy to make substances, or that break down substances to make energy. Any chemical reaction that's making a substance or breaking it down, using energy or making energy, that's metabolism. So hormone metabolism is going to take these fatty acids, it's going to use energy, and it's going to make a hormone. All right, so these fatty acids are pretty important. There's 2 types of fatty acids that you need to know. You need to know saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids are straight in structure, like their shape is straight, whereas an unsaturated fatty acid has this bent shape to it. And that's because saturated fatty acids have all single bonds in their carbons here. So you can see all the single bonds in the carbons, whereas an unsaturated fatty acid has this one carbon here with double bonds in it. So the carbon-carbon bond here, right here, is a double bond. Okay, whereas all the other ones are single bonds. Right, you can see single bond, oopsies. I was gonna use a pen for that. So here's the double bond, and then you can see the single bonds here. Single bond between these carbons here, but there's a double bond. There's a double bond right here. All right, that's different. There's a double bond right there. And then the rest are single bonds. They carry on until another double bond would make it bend in a different way. But when you have all single bonds, they just go they can organize themselves in a straight line. Right? So these are all single bonds. So all of these here are CH2 groups, whereas these ones here, this one, hold on. Yeah, this one and this one are just CH groups. right? They're missing a hydrogen. And so that's why they are unsaturated, because they don't have all of the hydrogens that a saturated fatty acid means. Saturated, if something is saturated, it means it is full of something. Okay, we usually use saturated to talk about concentration. It's full of the solute usually, or saturated in terms of like how wet something is, when your shirt is saturated with water, or when you've been exercising so much that you've been sweating a ton and your shirt gets all wet, you would say that your shirt is saturated. Okay, now because of this structure, you can see that the saturated fatty acids make this very straight structure. So overall, they kind of go in this straight line here, whereas the unsaturated fatty acids kind of bend. They bend here. Right? There's this bent shape here, and then they go down this way. So because of that, saturated fatty acids are able to squeeze tighter together. So you're able to, if you make it look like this, so you've got these saturated fatty acids, they're able to stick together much closer. They're able to pack together very closely. But an unsaturated fatty acid, on the other hand, is not able to stick together so well because it bends away. And so there's going to be these extra spaces, or this extra space needed for the saturated fatty acid to, or as you put more of them together, right? If they're unsaturated, they have these bends in them, and so they're not able to pack together as tightly. In other words, they're less dense, right? These are less dense, less tightly, right? Whereas these ones over here, these ones are tightly packed together, right? So there's less space. There's less space between the molecules. So for that reason, saturated fatty acids are typically solid at room temperature, and unsaturated fatty acids are liquid at room temperature. So things like animal fat, things like butter, things like cheese, those are all high in saturated fatty acids because they are typically solid at room temperature. So things like butter, animal fat, cheese, this stuff is typically high in saturated fat. Whereas oils like vegetable oils are typically liquid at room temperature. They have a higher amount of unsaturated fatty acids. And saturated fatty acids are typically known as the unhealthy fats, whereas unsaturated fats are known as the healthy fats. Okay, so you want to avoid the unhealthy fats, the saturated fats, right? You want to avoid these things, and you want to make sure that you consume, or that you try to that you include the healthy fats in your diet, the unsaturated fats. That's as long as only if you don't heat them. Don't heat them. If you heat an unsaturated fatty acid, then what you get, let's just go down here for a second. If you heat an unsaturated fatty acid, so let's go unsaturated fatty acid. If you add heat to that, so plus heat, that actually gives you something called a trans fat. And trans fats are unhealthy. Trans fats are unhealthy. Okay, and you get this in things like, you get trans fats in things like fried food. So like fried chicken, French fries, potato chips. All these things have a lot of trans fats in them typically. Okay, we kind of already talked about this, so I won't spend a lot of time. Just to review, triglycerides have these 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. So we've got a glycerol and we've got 3 fatty acid chains. Again, like we talked about, the majority of these chains here, these here are the the hydrocarbons, right? So this is the hydrocarbon chain here attached to this is the carboxylic acid, right? So we've got the hydrocarbon chain attached to the carboxylic acid. Carboxylic acid. And then over here, this here is the hydrocarbon chain. And this is what makes it nonpolar, right? So even though it looks like this might be making it polar because of these 2 oxygens here, this is just so long here. This long chain of carbon and hydrogen is very nonpolar. So overall, it's nonpolar. Okay, phospholipids. This is we talked about phospholipids a little bit already. So it's got these 2 parts here. It's got the I misspoke there. It's got 3 parts. It's got the fatty acids. Okay, they can be saturated or they can be unsaturated, or they can be both. They can both be saturated. They can both be unsaturated. But they've got 2 fatty acids, a glycerol attached to a glycerol, and then instead of a 3rd fatty acid, the 3rd fatty acid is replaced with a phosphate group. And remember that the phosphate is very polar, and all these oxygens here, right? We've got lots of oxygen in this molecule here. So we've got oxygen, 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 oxygen. So all of those oxygens are very polar. So they're going to pull electrons. Electrons are going to get pulled towards, let's not use that. Electrons are going to get pulled towards those oxygens. So overall, there'll be a negative charge around this whole group here. It will contain a slightly negative charge. And as a matter of fact, there's actually a full negative charge here. So it's a negative up here. So this is going to be, this part here is hydrophilic. Remember that hydrophilic, here's hydrophilic. Let's highlight it blue because it loves water. Remember that this is water, this is water loving. It loves water. And the hydrophobic tails, let's highlight this one orange or yellow maybe. Let's highlight this yellow. The hydrophobic tails, these are not, they don't like water. These ones are water fearing. They fear the water. They are non-polar. So in other words, this is non-polar. Whereas these ones here, the water loving is actually polar. So because of that, it actually creates something called a bilayer. So phospholipids form a bilayer. In other words, it makes 2 layers of phospholipids, right? 2 layers. So you can see here's one layer up here, and here's another layer down here. And you'll notice that the polar head is always hanging out with the water. The nonpolar tails are always facing in. Remember, these are nonpolar. They're always facing inward. So they actually point towards each other, these nonpolar parts. And then the polar phosphate group and glycerol, they point away. So they point towards the water. Okay, so they always want to face the water. So the polar wants to face the water because they like water. It's the hydrophilic, so it's water loving. But the nonpolar tails, they want to face each other. They don't want to hang out with the water. They want to stay away from the water. So they hide in the core here. So this makes a non-polar interior with these 2 polar, these are polar surfaces, the polar surfaces here. So this would be inside the cell, inside of a cell, and this would be outside. This would be outside of the cell. All right, so just to recap some things here, remember that carbohydrates, what type of biological molecule are they? These are polymers, these are macromolecules, and they are polymers. Lipids are only macromolecules, okay, not polymers. The elements are CHO in carbohydrates. It's also carbon, hydrogen, and some oxygen, right, in lipids. So there is oxygen, not quite as much, but there is oxygen. So you should put that there's oxygen. The monomer for carbohydrates is a monosaccharide. And this could be in the form of glucose. We talked about glucose, we talked about fructose, and we talked about galactose. But in lipids, it's only building blocks, right? Building blocks only. And these are typically glycerol and fatty acids. They're all held together. The building blocks, or the monomers, are always held together by covalent bonds. Remember, in lipids, there's a special bond called a glycosidic bond that holds the monosaccharides together. We don't need to talk about the type of covalent bond in lipids. Special examples of carbohydrates. You need to know the different types of simple sugars versus complex. Okay, remember we talked about the different monosaccharides, which we've got up here. Monosaccharides, and then we've also got the disaccharides, which were sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And the complex sugars, remember we talked about the starches. We talked about starch. We talked about glycogen. We talked about cellulose. And we talked about chitin. And these are polysaccharides. Here with the lipids, we talked about phospholipids. We talked about triglycerides. And we talked about hormones. What do sugars do? They provide energy, they provide structure, and cell identification. Whereas lipids, they store energy, they build membranes, and they are chemical messengers. Right? Phospholipids, they build cell membranes. Triglycerides store energy. Hormones are the chemical messengers. The energy molecules are typically our mono and disaccharides, are fast energy. Starch and glycogen are long-term energy. Structural carbohydrates are cellulose and chitin. And then we didn't talk about which ones are cell identification, but there are some carbohydrates can be stuck onto the phospholipids to identify cells as either on your team or against you, right? So either belonging to you or not. Anyways, that is lipids. Our next talk will be about proteins. So stay tuned for that one. Thanks, you guys, and let me know if you have any questions.